Walter stood at the boarding gate, watching the twinkling lights of the planes on the runway through the huge glass window. The clock on his wrist ticked almost midnight, and there was very little movement at the airport. A handful of passengers waited silently, some engrossed in their cell phones, others leafing through magazines disinterestedly. There was something unsettling about the tranquility of the place at that hour, as if the silence carried a promise of something unexpected. While Walter waited, his thoughts wandered to the reason for the trip. A business conference in another city. Nothing out of the ordinary. He had made similar trips countless times before. However, on that particular evening, a slight feeling lodged itself in his mind, like a whisper that something wasn't right. He tried to push the thought away, attributing it to tiredness and the late hour. The boarding call finally echoed through the loudspeakers, and Walter joined the small queue that was forming. The plane was a smaller model, more suitable for night flights with few passengers. As he entered the aircraft, he was greeted by the polite smile of a flight attendant, who indicated his row. Walter made his way down the narrow aisle until he found his window seat, placing his backpack under the seat in front of him. While fastening his seatbelt, Walter noticed that the plane was strangely empty. He quickly counted no more than a dozen passengers spread across the rows. Maybe people preferred daytime flights, he thought, trying not to take any notice of the fact. He was about to relax when he heard the faint sound of footsteps in the aisle. He looked up and saw an ordinary-looking middle-aged man walking towards him. The man was wearing a dark suit. His tie was a little disheveled and his eyes were clearly tired. Without saying a word, the man settled into the armchair next to Walter. A slight nod was the only greeting he exchanged. Walter returned the gesture, forcing a polite smile. Part of him wished the man wouldn't try to strike up a conversation, as he wanted to rest during the flight. The noise of the turbines increased, and the plane began to taxi towards the runway. Walter leaned his head against the window, watching the airport lights drift away. His thoughts wandered between work and the desire to sleep. The pilot's voice echoed briefly through the cabin, informing him of the altitude and estimated duration of the flight. The voice sounded distant to Walter, as if he were listening underwater. As soon as the plane took off, cutting through the night sky, Walter felt a light touch on his arm. He turned and saw the man next to him, now closer, an almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "Night flights always have a different atmosphere, don't you think?" said the man, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Walter hesitated before answering, trying to gauge the tone of the conversation. "Yes, I think so," he replied, trying to sound uninterested. "Less movement, quieter." The man nodded, as if the answer confirmed something he already knew. "Quiet, but sometimes a little too lonely," he commented, letting the phrase hang in the air. Walter didn't know exactly what to say. There was something about the way the man spoke, a slow, measured cadence that made his words seem deeper than they really were. He settled into his seat, feeling slightly uncomfortable. The flight had barely started, and Walter already felt that the night was going to be longer than he had imagined. Chapter 2. The Passenger. Next Door. Walter looked again at the man next to him. He looked ordinary, but there was something about him that didn't fit, a disguised restlessness behind his tired gaze. His dark eyes seemed to observe every detail around him, as if he were constantly absorbing information. Walter tried to ignore the feeling of unease, reminding himself that he was just a stranger with whom he would have to share the flight. The man, sensing Walter's hesitation, held out his hand. "Excuse my lack of manners. I'm Paul," he said with a polite smile, although his eyes didn't convey the same cordiality. Walter squeezed Paul's hand, forcing a smile in response. "Walter, nice to meet you." Paul nodded, still keeping his gaze fixed on Walter for a moment longer than necessary before leaning back in his seat. Walter sensed a slight tension in the air, an expectation that Paul was going to continue the conversation. He took a book from his bag, an obvious effort to concentrate on something else, but Paul's presence next to him made it difficult to switch off. "You know, Walter," Paul began, after a brief silence, "I used to travel by plane a lot, but not by choice, you know. Work demanded it. But now, even when I don't have to, I still find myself taking those night flights." He laughed lightly, without humor. Walter turned a page in his book, but the words seemed blurred. He felt compelled to respond, to join in the conversation, even though a part of his mind was screaming at him to keep quiet. "I see. I think flying at night might be quieter, less distractions." Paul let out a sound that could have been a laugh or a sigh. "Fewer distractions, yes." He paused, looking straight ahead, as if remembering something. "But at the same time, there's something unsettling about being so many meters off the ground in the middle of the darkness. It's as if we're at the mercy of something much bigger than ourselves." Walter closed the book, resigned to the fact that the reading wasn't going to happen. He looked at Paul, trying to understand what the man wanted with this conversation. Paul seemed to be watching him with intense interest, almost as if he were studying his reactions. "You never thought of that?" Paul asked, leaning slightly towards Walter. "Being in a place where you have no control, where a single failure could mean the end of everything?" Walter felt a shiver run down his spine. The way Paul spoke, with an unsettling serenity, made his words seem more threatening than they were. He tried to pull himself together, shrugging casually. "I don't think so. I've always trusted the team and the drivers." Paul smiled again, but this time there was something almost sarcastic in his smile. "Yes, trust. It's important." He paused, as if savoring the word. "But sometimes trust is what puts us in danger, isn't it?" Walter didn't reply immediately. The intensity in Paul's voice and the weight of his words were beginning to create a sense of unease that he couldn't ignore. It was as if Paul was hinting at something deeper, something Walter couldn't quite grasp. Paul leaned back again, seemingly satisfied with the silence he had created. The conversation died there, but the unease remained. Walter looked out of the window, trying to find relief in the darkness outside, but felt only the reflection of his own confused thoughts. As the aircraft sliced through the night sky, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into an enigma that he hadn't asked to solve. And as the flight went on, Paul's presence beside him became heavier and heavier, like a shadow that refused to go away. The plane sailed smoothly through the skies, and the cabin lights were soft, creating a relaxing atmosphere. Walter tried to settle in, but the conversation with Paul continued to disturb his thoughts. Paul, for his part, seemed comfortable, as if he was just beginning to get on with his neighbor. "Have you heard about Flight 447? Paul asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. Walter raised his head, surprised by the sudden change of subject. He wasn't familiar with the flight number, but curiosity made him pay attention. "No, I didn't. What happened?" Paul leaned forward a little more, as if to make sure no one else could hear. His eyes shone with an intensity that made Walter uncomfortable. "It was a transatlantic Air France flight, if I'm not mistaken. In 2009, it disappeared from radar in the middle of a storm. They never found the whole plane. Only a few pieces of debris were found after months." Paul paused, as if waiting for Walter to absorb the information. Walter swallowed. The description was graphic and disturbing, and he struggled not to let his discomfort show. Paul's calmness was in stark contrast to the gloomy content of the conversation. "That's terrible," Walter said, trying to keep the conversation light. "It must have been a horrible experience for the families." Paul nodded slowly, but the gleam in his eyes didn't diminish. "Horrible, yes. But did you know that there are people who believe that this kind of accident isn't just a technical error or a weather problem?" Paul continued, without waiting for an answer. Walter frowned. He didn't know where Paul was going with this conversation, but his tone was becoming increasingly unsettling. "What do you mean?" "Some people believe that there are forces beyond our control that act in these moments," Paul said, looking directly at Walter. "I'm not talking about supernatural things, but perhaps something that is beyond our understanding." Walter shook his head, trying to look away. The conversation was beginning to feel more like a lecture on bizarre theories than a simple exchange of stories. "I prefer to believe that it's just technical faults and human error." Paul laughed softly, a sound that didn't seem very humorous. "It's more comfortable that way, isn't it? But the truth is that we often don't have the answers to what really happened. Some stories remain open, like Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. It disappeared without a trace. Nobody knows what really happened." Walter looked out of the window again, trying to concentrate on the distant lights. The discomfort was growing, and he was beginning to wish the conversation would end. "And do you know any other stories?" Walter asked, trying to change the subject, but without sounding rude. Paul seemed pleased with the change of topic, and continued with an almost enthusiastic gleam in his eyes. There are so many stories. Like Flight 19, a group of military planes that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. They were on a training exercise and just disappeared. They were never found." Paul's tone was getting darker and darker, and Walter felt a chill run down his spine. The atmosphere around him seemed to have changed, and he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being drawn into something he didn't understand. Paul continued talking, describing disturbing details of plane crashes, each one more macabre than the last. Walter was beginning to feel physically ill, his mind being flooded with horrible images. The conversation seemed to drag on for hours, with Paul detailing stories of unexplained disappearances and events that defied logic. Every word seemed designed to upset Walter even more, and the sense of unease was palpable. Finally, when Paul finished telling the last story, there was a heavy silence between the two of them. Walter was completely absorbed in his thoughts, feeling the growing pressure in his chest. He wondered if the man next to him was deliberately trying to scare him, or if there was something more sinister at play. As the plane continued on its way, Walter's sense of unease didn't subside. He was caught between reality and the unsettling feeling that something was deeply wrong. Walter tried hard to ignore the growing discomfort he felt. The disturbing stories told by Paul had left an indelible mark on his mind. The cabin was quiet, and the soft lights still cast a soothing glow. But the silence was not comforting. Instead, it seemed to carry an inexplicable weight. Paul, apparently unperturbed, continued to stare out of the window, lost in thought. Suddenly, he turned to Walter with an enigmatic glint in his eyes. "Have you ever heard of people reporting seeing strange things during flights?" Paul asked, his voice soft and almost conspiratorial. Walter raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain a tone of genuine curiosity. "Not exactly. What kind of things?" Paul leaned forward a little, as if he were sharing a secret. The expression on Paul's face was a mixture of fascination and unease. There have been reports of passengers seeing strange figures outside the window amidst the clouds, as if they were watching the plane, or even heard unexplained sounds like whispering voices when the flight was quiet. Walter forced himself to laugh a little, trying to dispel the growing discomfort. "It's probably just a tired mind or imagination. Sometimes darkness and silence can play with our perception." Paul smiled, a smile that seemed to have a hint of malice in it. "Maybe. But what would you say if I told you that there are records of pilots and crews who have also reported strange phenomena? Things that can't be easily explained. Like when the plane seems to change course on its own, or when the navigation control fails inexplicably." Walter swallowed. His mind was full of disturbing images, and the idea of unexplained phenomena on board an airplane didn't help. He looked around, trying to find some relief in the normality of the cabin. "Are you saying that these things really happen?" Walter asked, his voice betraying a touch of apprehension. Paul nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. "There's a story that particularly intrigues me. A flight that crossed an area of turbulence and suddenly began to experience a series of technical faults, as if the system was being sabotaged. But there was no sign of physical damage." Walter began to feel a chill run down his spine. The feeling was that the conversation was delving into increasingly unsettling territory. "And what happened to the flight?" Walter asked. Even though he knew he shouldn't want to know more, Paul paused. The silence between them seemed to carry an electric tension. The flight managed to land, but the pilot reported a strange sensation during the turbulence, as if something was interfering with communication and control. Some passengers claimed to have seen a figure standing in the cabin, although no one saw it clearly. After the incident, the airline withdrew the plane from service and carried out an investigation which was never fully revealed to the public. Walter was silent, his mind spinning with information. He began to realize that Paul was telling these stories with a purpose, trying to provoke a specific reaction. Walter's discomfort intensified, and he felt a growing need to change the subject. "It must be difficult for those who go through these experiences," said Walter, trying to sound lighter. "How do you deal with these stories?" Paul looked at Walter, the smile disappearing from his lips. "Some people cope better than others. For me, these stories are fascinating because they reveal how the human mind reacts to the unknown, the fear of the inexplicable, the feeling of having no control. That's what makes us question reality." Walter tried to concentrate on something more tangible, but Paul's conversation continued to haunt his thoughts. He looked around, trying to find some comfort in the normality of the cabin, but the feeling of unease persisted. The plane continued its course through the night, and the feeling that something was wrong hung in the air. Walter couldn't shake the impression that Paul was playing a psychological game with him, and the weight of the words didn't make the night seem any shorter. As the flight progressed, Walter wondered if Paul's stories were just fiction, or if there was something more sinister at play. The feeling that something was deeply wrong remained, and the discomfort he felt seemed to intensify with every passing minute. Walter tried hard to remain calm, but Paul's disturbing conversation and the unsettling stories about accidents and unexplained phenomena had left a heavy weight on his shoulders. The cabin of the plane seemed to have become colder, and the atmosphere around him was charged with an almost palpable tension. Paul had looked out of the window again. His silence seemed contemplative. But for Walter, it was a constant reminder of the strange conversation they were having. The discomfort grew by the minute, and Walter tried to concentrate on anything that might distract him. He picked up his book again, but the words on the page seemed to blur into a fog of confusion and fear. After a few moments of frustration with his reading, Walter decided to take a walk down the corridor, thinking that perhaps some fresh air, or simply a change of scenery, might help to relieve the oppressive feeling. He stood up and, with a visible effort, made his way to the bathroom at the back of the cabin. The aisle was deserted, except for one or two passengers asleep in their seats. Walter hurried to the bathroom, relieved to have a moment of privacy. As he looked in the mirror, he tried to calm down by washing his face with cold water and taking a deep breath. However, the discomfort wouldn't go away. He couldn't stop thinking about Paul's stories and the feeling that something was very wrong. He returned to the cabin, trying to look relaxed, but the feeling that something was watching him wouldn't go away. When he reached his seat again, Paul was still there, now reading a newspaper with a neutral expression on his face. Walter tried to ignore the man and settled down again, but something in Paul's expression made him feel even more uncomfortable. Suddenly, Walter realized that something was out of place. The seat next to Paul was empty, but he didn't remember anyone getting up or leaving. He looked around and noticed that none of the other passengers seemed to have noticed any strange movements. A chill ran down his spine, and he wondered if he was imagining things. Walter decided to speak to one of the flight attendants, hoping to get some clarification on the situation. He got up again and went to the beginning of the corridor where one of the flight attendants was talking to a colleague. "Excuse me," said Walter, trying to keep his voice calm. "I was talking to a passenger next to me, but now he seems to have disappeared. Did you see anyone leave or anything?" The flight attendant looked at him with an expression of surprise and confusion. "Sorry, sir, but we have no record of any passengers getting up or leaving. In fact, the seat next to yours is registered as empty." Walter frowned, confused. He knew that he had seen Paul there, that he had talked to him. The feeling that something was deeply wrong was growing. "Are you sure? I spoke to him earlier," Walter insisted. The flight attendant checked her tablet again, and her expression didn't change. "In fact, there's no record of anyone sitting next to you apart from you. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding." Walter turned away, feeling his unease grow. He returned to his seat, trying to process the situation. Paul was absent, and no one else seemed to remember him. The unease was now turning into a growing sense of panic. Walter looked around, trying to understand what was going on. The cabin looked the same, but there was something different. He felt an invisible presence, as if something was watching him. The feeling that he was in a nightmare intensified, and he struggled to keep his composure. As the plane continued its journey through the night, Walter wondered if he was losing his sanity or if there was something more sinister at play. Paul's absence and the mystery surrounding his presence seemed to weave themselves into a web of unease that Walter couldn't untangle. The flight seemed to be turning into a terrifying experience, and he didn't know if they would make it to their destination without any more disturbing surprises. Walter couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had accompanied him since Paul's disappearance. The plane continued its night flight, cutting through the darkness, and the silence in the cabin seemed more oppressive than ever. The constant feeling of unease was now a constant presence, as if the very air was charged with an indescribable tension. He tried hard to remain calm, but every little detail seemed amplified. The noise of the turbines was a monotonous, constant sound, and the cabin lights flickered softly, creating unsettling shadows on the walls. Walter felt like he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Determined to understand what was going on, Walter decided to review what he knew. Paul had disappeared inexplicably, and no one seemed to remember him. The disturbing stories Paul had told kept echoing in his mind, and Walter wondered if there was any connection between them and the current situation. He looked around the cabin, looking for any sign of anything out of the ordinary. The number of passengers seemed consistent with what he had seen before, and none of them seemed to notice any anomalies. The feeling of being watched persisted, adding to the paranoia that enveloped him. Walter decided to walk around the corridor one more time, hoping to find something that could explain what was going on. He stood up and walked around slowly, carefully observing every detail. The corridor was quiet, with passengers asleep or entertained on their own devices. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't diminish. As he passed the aircraft's galley, he noticed that one of the doors was slightly ajar. Curious, he approached and peeked inside. The small area was empty, except for some supplies and onboard utensils. Nothing that seemed to indicate a problem, but the feeling of discomfort persisted. Suddenly, Walter heard a subtle sound, like a distant murmur. He looked around, trying to identify the source of the sound. The murmur seemed to be coming from somewhere in the cabin, but there were no passengers nearby. The sound was indistinct, like a muffled conversation, and its origin was impossible to determine. Walter walked away from the kitchen, his heart beating faster. He returned to his seat and tried to calm down, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong wouldn't go away. He began to wonder if the experience was affecting his perception of reality. Sitting back in his seat, Walter tried to rationalize the situation. He looked at the book in his hand, trying to distract himself with reading, but the words still seemed blurred. He felt he needed to do something to get answers, but he didn't know where to start. The cabin was silent, and the atmosphere seemed to be in a state of suspension. Walter felt that time was dragging on, and that each minute was becoming more interminable. Paul's absence and the disturbing stories told by the man were beginning to intertwine in his mind, creating a growing sense of paranoia. Then a new idea popped into his head. He remembered the stories Paul had told him about unexplained phenomena and mysterious disappearances. Paul's disappearance seemed to follow a similar pattern. If these stories were true, perhaps there was a logical explanation, a reason for what was happening. Walter decided to seek help from one of the crew members. He got up and went to the beginning of the aisle, where one of the flight attendants was talking to a passenger. He waited patiently until she approached and, in a calm tone of voice, explained the situation. "Excuse me, I was wondering if you could help me with a question. A passenger next to me has disappeared, and now I'm starting to feel rather uncomfortable." Walter tried to remain calm, but the concern was evident in his voice. The flight attendant looked at him with an expression of surprise and concern. "I'm sorry to hear that. We have no record of any incident. Let me check again to make sure everything is in order." As she walked away to consult with the team, Walter felt the sense of paradox grow. He was on a plane, surrounded by people and technology, but reality seemed to be crumbling around him. The feeling that something was very wrong wouldn't go away, and he wondered if there was a rational explanation for what was happening, or if he was simply losing control of the situation. Time continued to drag on, and the feeling of being in a slowly unfolding nightmare remained, each minute making the experience even more distressing. The cabin was silent, and Walter felt that every movement was a small battle against the fear and confusion that dominated his mind. Walter waited anxiously while the flight attendant consulted with the crew. The corridor seemed colder and quieter, and Walter's discomfort was becoming almost unbearable. He wondered if the flight attendant would be able to offer any explanation for Paul's disappearance, or if his search for answers would only increase his sense of panic. Finally, the stewardess returned, her expression still worried, but showing no signs of alarm. "Sir, we have carried out a thorough check and found no anomalies. The seat next to you has been registered as empty since the start of the flight. There is no sign of anyone having sat there apart from you." Walter felt a wave of frustration and confusion. "But I talked to someone. I'm sure of it. He stood next to me and told me stories about accidents and unexplained phenomena. How could that be possible?" The flight attendant looked at him with a mixture of empathy and doubt. "I understand your concern, but it may have been a misunderstanding. Sometimes pressure and tiredness can affect our perception of reality. If you need further assistance, we're here to help." Walter tried to accept the explanation, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong didn't subside. He decided to go back to his seat and sit down, trying to process the conversation and the situation. The cabin seemed normal, but the feeling of unease persisted. As Walter tried to calm down, he noticed a small detail that had previously gone unnoticed. The armchair next to him, the same place where Paul had sat, had a strange detail. A small piece of paper was stuck between the cushions and, with some difficulty, Walter managed to pull it out. He carefully unfolded the paper. There was a handwritten message in a handwriting that looked rushed. "Don't trust anyone. What's here is not what it seems." The message made Walter's heart race. He read and reread the words, trying to understand what they meant. Who could have left this message? And why would someone say not to trust anyone? Walter looked around, trying to identify anyone who might be involved, but all the passengers were immersed in their own activities, with no sign of concern or knowing anything out of the ordinary. With the paper still in his hands, Walter stood up again and headed for the cockpit. He knew he had to act cautiously, but he felt an urgent need to understand what was going on. When he reached the cockpit, he knocked gently on the door, and one of the pilots opened it with a curious look on his face. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm going through a strange situation, and I'd like to know if you've noticed anything unusual," said Walter, trying to remain calm. The pilot looked at him with an expression of professionalism, but also of concern. "We have nothing to report, sir. The flight is going according to plan, and the systems are operating normally." "Why do you ask?" Walter hesitated for a moment, holding the paper in his hand. "I found it in the armchair next to me. I thought there might be some implication, considering what happened." The pilot took the paper and read it quickly. His expression changed to one of confusion and concern. "We have no record of any problems or similar messages. I'll check the systems and security again. If you need anything else, please let us know." Walter thanked him and walked away, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just experienced. The pilot was being professional, but the message left a feeling that there was something more sinister afoot. Back in his seat, Walter sat down and tried to rationalize the situation. The cryptic message seemed to be connected to the disturbing experience he was going through. But how could he move on? And who had left the message? Paul or someone else? The cabin was still silent, and the feeling that something was about to happen was almost palpable. Walter felt a chill and began to look more closely at the passengers around him, trying to find any clue that might explain what was happening. Time seemed to drag on as the flight continued its nocturnal trajectory. Walter's restlessness was at its peak, and he didn't know what to expect next. Every minute seemed to be filled with anticipation and fear, and the feeling that something was about to be revealed hung over him, increasing the tension with every passing moment. Walter was restless. The feeling that something was about to happen was almost palpable. The cabin was quiet, but the tension in the air seemed to be growing. The cryptic message he had found on the seat next to him continued to plague his thoughts. He wondered if there was any connection between the message and the events that were unfolding. Determined to find an explanation, Walter began to look more closely at the passengers around him. The cabin was mostly dark, with the reading lights on, creating an atmosphere of shadows and whispers. He noticed that some passengers were restless, fidgeting in their seats or talking quietly, but it seemed to be just the normal effect of travel. He noticed a woman with a tense expression, looking around frequently. There was something about her attitude that caught Walter's attention. He decided to approach her, and in a gentle tone of voice, asked, "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you all right? You seemed a bit nervous." The woman looked at him, her eyes showing a mixture of surprise and relief. Yes, I'm fine. I'm just a bit anxious about the flight. It's just..." She hesitated, seeming to consider whether to continue. "I heard some strange sounds coming from the cabin during the night. I don't know if it's just my imagination." Walter felt a chill run down his spine. The woman's experience seemed to echo the unease he was feeling. "What kind of sounds?" he asked, trying to get more information. "It was like a whisper, or maybe a whisper," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I couldn't identify the source, but it sounded very close, as if someone was talking in a low voice." Walter looked around, trying to see if anyone else was noticing what was going on. The atmosphere remained calm, but the feeling that something was happening was undeniable. "I've also noticed something strange," Walter confessed. "I found a strange message on my armchair. I don't know what it means, but I feel there's something wrong." The woman looked at him with an expression of growing concern. "I've read about cases like this before, where people report strange experiences during flights. Sometimes it's just hallucinations or the effect of pressure. But if you found a message, that's different." Walter agreed, feeling a growing need to find out what was going on. He realized that the woman was as upset as he was, and decided that perhaps he needed her help to face what was happening. "Maybe we should look for the flight attendant again and see if she can help," Walter suggested. "Something is definitely out of place, and we need answers." The woman agreed with a nervous nod, and the two of them headed towards the area where the flight attendant was talking to another passenger. Walter hesitated for a moment, looking around the cabin and wondering if they were about to discover something that could explain what was happening. When they reached the stewardess, Walter and his wife shared their concerns. The stewardess listened attentively and made a worried expression. "I understand that you're worried, but I need to make sure there's no cause for alarm. I'll do a new check with the team and also check the communication systems." The flight attendant moved away again, and Walter and the woman remained in the aisle, watching her expectantly. The cabin seemed to have fallen into a deep silence, as if the tension in the air had reached a critical point. After a few minutes, the flight attendant returned with a more serious expression. "We did a complete review and found nothing wrong. There are no reports of any problems with the flight or safety. However, if you continue to feel uncomfortable, we may consider other measures, such as checking the cabin camera system." Walter and the woman exchanged glances. The proposal to check the camera system seemed like an additional step, but perhaps it was necessary in order to discover the truth. "Please do," Walter asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Something is definitely wrong, and we need answers." The flight attendant nodded and moved away again to carry out the promised checks. Walter and his wife returned to their seats, the feeling of expectation and unease continuing to grow. As they waited, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The cabin was silent, but the atmosphere seemed to be in a state of suspense, as if it were preparing to reveal something dark. Every minute dragged by, and the feeling that something was about to be discovered was almost unbearable. Walter felt he was getting closer to the truth, but the wait was becoming more and more agonizing. What else could he find out before the end of that flight? Walter and his wife waited with growing anxiety while the flight attendant carried out the necessary checks. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed heavier than ever, and the anticipation of finding out what was really going on was creating an almost palpable tension. Finally, the flight attendant returned with a tablet in hand, her expression showing a mixture of seriousness and concern. "We checked the camera system and did a complete review of the records," she announced. "However, we didn't find any anomalies. The system hasn't registered any unusual activity, and the security logs are all in order." Walter felt a pang of frustration, but the woman next to him seemed equally discouraged. "But that can't be possible," Walter insisted. "I saw the person. I talked to them. If the system didn't register anything, what does that mean?" The flight attendant paused, looking at them with a worried expression. "Sometimes there can be technical problems that aren't immediately apparent. If you still feel that something is wrong, we can consider other options. But I must stress that the flight is operating normally, and there are no signs of imminent problems." Walter and the woman exchanged glances, both with the feeling that they were missing something important. They decided that, in order to get more answers, they should review the camera recordings themselves. The flight attendant agreed to help them, taking them to a restricted area where they could watch the recordings on a monitor. In the small monitoring office, the flight attendant connected the tablet to a larger monitor and began reviewing the recordings from the internal cameras. Walter and his wife watched intently, observing every movement in the cabin. The images showed passengers, crew, and the cabin itself from various angles, but nothing to indicate an extra presence or any strange activity. Walter began to feel a new kind of frustration, but he wasn't ready to give up. As they watched the images, one particular sequence caught Walter's eye. At one point, he saw the image of the seat next to him, the place where Paul had sat. The camera showed the seat empty, but in a fleeting instant, before the camera changed angle, Walter noticed a fuzzy figure, like a shadow, which seemed to dissolve in the same split second. "Wait, come back a bit," said Walter, pointing at the monitor. "I think I saw something there." The flight attendant rewound the recording and paused at the part Walter had indicated. The image showed the nebulous figure more clearly, an indistinct shadow that seemed to move quickly. The sensation of a presence was almost visible on the screen. "What's that?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," replied Walter, "but it seems that there was something there that we couldn't see with the naked eye." The flight attendant frowned, watching the recording carefully. "This is definitely unusual. I'll need to report this to the security team and see if there's any explanation for this image." While the flight attendant took notes and prepared a report, Walter and his wife tried to process what they were seeing. The monitor displayed the enigmatic shadow, but the full meaning was still unclear. Walter felt a growing sense of despair, as if the truth was within reach, but still elusive. "What do you think that means?" asked the woman. "I'm not sure, but it seems that the shadow could be related to Paul's disappearance," said Walter. "Maybe there's a darker explanation for all this." The stewardess returned with a determined expression. "I will report this immediately and make sure that the security team and airline officials are aware. If there is anything else, it will certainly be investigated thoroughly." Walter and the woman thanked him and returned to their seats, now more anxious than ever. The cabin was still quiet, but the feeling that something was about to be revealed was intensifying. With each passing minute, the mystery surrounding Paul and the strange presence seemed to deepen. Walter felt he was getting closer to the truth, but the wait was becoming more and more agonizing. The feeling that something sinister was lurking in the shadows of the cabin made time drag slowly, and the question of how and why the shadow had appeared continued to haunt his thoughts. The flight continued its journey through the night, and Walter prepared himself to face any revelations that might follow, while the mystery surrounding Paul and the enigmatic presence became more intricate by the moment. Chapter 10. The Enigma of the Missing Girl. Walter was becoming increasingly anxious. The mystery surrounding the missing passenger and the enigmatic shadow on the security cameras continued to dominate his thoughts. The feeling of being in a growing nightmare made every minute seem endless. The cabin was silent, with most of the passengers asleep, but for Walter, the calm was just an illusion. He was trying hard to stay calm, but the atmosphere around him seemed increasingly oppressive. The woman he had been talking to was standing next to him, her face marked by a mixture of fear and tiredness. They had spent the last part of the trip trying to decipher the meaning of the shadow seen on the recordings, but without success. The flight attendant had promised to report the incident, but Walter wasn't sure if this would really lead to any concrete answers. He felt like he was on the verge of something, but he couldn't see the full picture. Each new discovery only seemed to raise more questions. Suddenly, Walter felt a new sense of unease. He noticed that the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The air seemed denser, and a cold sensation was beginning to creep in. He looked around, noticing that some passengers were starting to move restlessly, as if they were feeling the same pressure as him. The woman next to her also seemed agitated. She got up and started walking down the corridor, trying to distract herself from her growing panic. Walter decided to accompany her, thinking that perhaps the change of environment would help clear his mind. As they walked down the aisle, Walter noticed a flight attendant heading quickly towards the back of the plane. There was an expression of concern on her face, which made Walter wonder if there was something else going on that he didn't already know about. The woman next to him followed him to where the flight attendant was standing, and Walter decided to ask her if she knew anything else. "What's going on? Why does the crew look so worried?" Walter asked. The flight attendant gave him a serious look. "We are investigating some irregularities in the flight's communication system. There was a brief communication problem, but it has been resolved. There's nothing to worry about." Walter wasn't convinced. The feeling that something was wrong persisted, and he felt he was getting closer to an answer. He realized that the only way to find out what was going on would be to investigate on his own. Determined to find more answers, Walter returned to his seat and began to go through the message he had found again. He analyzed every word, trying to find any detail that might have gone unnoticed. The message read, "Trust no one. What is here is not what it seems." These words kept echoing in his mind. He began to think about the stories Paul had told him about plane crashes and unexplained phenomena. Perhaps there was a connection between these stories and what was happening now. While Walter was lost in his thoughts, the cabin began to change again. The lights began to flicker, and a strange sound began to fill the air. It was like a distant whisper, an indistinct voice that seemed to be speaking directly to him. Walter tried to identify the origin of the sound, but it was impossible to locate its source. The feeling of being in a continuous nightmare was becoming almost unbearable. He got up and started walking down the corridor again, trying to find some explanation for what he was hearing. The woman next to him also seemed upset and approached Walter. "I can't understand what's going on. There's something strange in the air," she said, her voice filled with fear. Walter tried to reassure her, but the feeling of panic was contagious. He began to wonder if the solution to the mystery was closer than he thought. Perhaps there was a logical explanation for what was happening, but he needed to find the missing piece. As they continued to wander down the corridor, Walter spotted an area where the crew were gathered, discussing in low voices. He approached discreetly and heard fragments of the conversation. "We need to find a solution quickly. We can't allow this to affect the flight," said a crew member. Walter felt a chill run down his spine. What exactly was going on? The feeling that something sinister was unfolding was becoming stronger and stronger. He decided he needed to act before it was too late. With his heart racing, Walter moved away from the crew area and began a more detailed search of the cabin. He looked for anything that might provide an additional clue as to what was going on. The feeling that something was about to be revealed was intensifying by the moment. As the cabin continued its nightly journey, Walter's anxiety and fear were at their peak. He knew he was on the verge of an important discovery, but the question was, would he be able to find the answers before it was too late? Walter walked down the corridor, his mind a mixture of confusion and fear. The feeling that something was about to be revealed seemed to grow with each passing minute. He couldn't ignore the feeling that he was approaching something crucial, and the enigmatic presence he had felt since the beginning of the flight seemed to be becoming more intense. The cabin was in a state of growing unease. Some passengers' reading lights flashed intermittently, and the sound of distant murmuring continued to fill the air. Walter decided that he needed to find some concrete answer before the situation got even more out of hand. He headed back to the area where the crew was gathered, trying to find an opportunity to talk to someone who could provide more information. When he got there, he noticed that the crew were engaged in a heated discussion, their voices low but tense. "We need to resolve this immediately. We can't allow the problem to affect the safety of the flight," said one of the crew members. Walter approached and with a calm and determined tone of voice asked, "Sorry to interrupt, but what's going on? I feel there's something wrong with the flight. I need to know if there's anything that can help me understand the situation better." The crew members exchanged apprehensive glances before one of the flight attendants turned to him. "Sir, you must understand that we are dealing with a delicate situation. There has been a technical fault which is causing some communication and control problems. We are doing our best to resolve this, but it is important that you and the other passengers remain calm and follow the safety instructions." Walter felt a lump in his throat. Technical failure seemed to be the explanation he was hearing, but the feeling that there was something more remained. He wasn't willing to accept a simplistic explanation without further investigation. "I found a strange message and a shadow on the security recordings. This can't be explained by a technical fault," insisted Walter. "I need more information. Is there any possibility that there's a more serious problem here?" The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling with what to reveal. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke in a low tone. "There was an incident during the flight that was not officially recorded. A passenger disappeared without a trace, and we're trying to find out what really happened. The security recordings may have captured something that we haven't yet been able to fully identify." Walter felt a wave of panic. The disappearance of a passenger confirmed his worst suspicions. "Who was the passenger?" Walter asked, his voice trembling. "We can't give you any details at the moment," replied the flight attendant. "But we do know that he was in a seat next to yours. The situation is being investigated, and the most important thing now is to ensure the safety of everyone on board." Walter thanked the flight attendant and walked away, feeling a new urgency to find out the truth. He needed to find some way to connect the dots and solve the mystery before the flight reached its destination. As he walked back to his seat, he noticed that the woman he had been talking to was looking at him with a worried expression. Walter approached her. "I've discovered that a passenger has gone missing," he said, trying to remain calm. The flight attendant confirmed that we're dealing with a more serious problem than just a technical fault. The woman took a deep breath, clearly frightened. "What are we going to do now?" she asked. "We need to investigate on our own," Walter replied. "If there's a connection between the disappearance and what we saw on the recordings, then the answer must lie somewhere around here. Let's look for any additional clues." They decided to do a more detailed search of the cabin, looking for any details that might have been overlooked. Walter revisited the seat where Paul had sat, looking for anything that might have been left behind. He found some notes and loose papers, but nothing that seemed significant. As they searched, the distant murmuring began to intensify, becoming almost deafening. Walter noticed that the feeling of cold was growing, and an aura of tension seemed to envelop the cabin. He sensed that they were approaching something important. Suddenly, the main light in the cabin began to flicker violently, plunging the area into an intermittent gloom. The sound of murmuring was now accompanied by a low hum, almost as if something was trying to manifest itself. Walter and the woman stood in the middle of the cabin, both looking around with growing anxiety. Whatever was happening seemed to be intensifying, and they needed to find an answer before it was too late. With his heart racing and his mind full of questions, Walter knew he was on the verge of discovering something crucial. The question was, could they find the answers before the flight reached its final destination? Walter and the woman continued their desperate search for the cabin as the tension built up with each passing moment. The sound of murmuring seemed to be getting louder, and the flashing lights created a chaotic atmosphere. They were determined to find an explanation for what was happening, knowing that time was running out. The flight had spent most of the night in a state of increasing restlessness. The movement of the lights and the constant background sound were beginning to affect most of the passengers, who were visibly upset and restless. The crew seemed to be struggling to keep calm and ensure the safety of everyone on board. But the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to control. While Walter and his wife were looking for clues, they passed the spot where the flight attendant had mentioned that the missing passenger was sitting. Walter remembered the enigmatic shadow he had seen on the recordings and decided to investigate the area once more. Searching the area thoroughly, Walter found something that had previously been hidden under the armchair. It was a small notebook with a worn cover and folded ears. Walter opened the notebook and found scribbled notes, written in a hurried and confused style. The notes described a series of disturbing events, including accounts of encounters with strange figures and sensations that something was wrong on board the plane. The pages were filled with drawings and incomplete sentences, reflecting the author's disturbed mental state. Walter and his wife read the notes in silence, the content increasingly disturbing. It seemed that the author of the notebook had experienced a growing sense of paranoia and fear, specifically mentioning a mysterious passenger who had caused a feeling of unease. The author also mentioned something about the real danger being invisible. While they were immersed in reading, the cabin suddenly plunged into total darkness. The sound of murmuring became deafening, and the feeling of cold was almost unbearable. Walter and the woman felt an overwhelming presence, as if they were surrounded by something invisible and threatening. In the middle of the darkness, a metallic sound of doors closing and an emergency warning echoed through the cabin, announcing that the plane was approaching its destination. The emergency light came on, revealing a disordered and disturbed environment. Walter and his wife clutched their notebooks, sensing that they were close to something crucial. Finally, the cabin began to light up again, and the vision of the passengers and crew was slowly being restored. The sense of ominous presence began to fade, but the tension in the air was still palpable. The flight attendant approached again, her countenance a mixture of relief and concern. "What did you find?" she asked, looking at the notebook Walter was holding. Walter explained what he had discovered and how the notes seemed to connect with the strange events they had experienced. The stewardess examined the notebook carefully, and her expression changed to one of understanding. It seems that the missing passenger was experiencing a growing sense of paranoia and fear. The notebook may have been his attempt to document what was happening, she said. "Thank you for finding it. Well, make sure it's investigated properly." As the plane prepared to land, Walter and his wife felt a sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. They had faced a terrifying mystery and had managed to find some answers, but the experience had left them deeply shaken. As the plane touched the ground and the cabin began to empty, Walter looked at the woman next to him. "Thank you for your help. Without you, I wouldn't have been able to face this alone," he said. The woman smiled tiredly and nodded. "I think we face something that few could understand. I hope we can find peace after all this." Walter agreed, feeling that the experience had brought them together in an unexpected way. The mystery of the missing passenger and the enigma of the strange presence on board remained partially solved, but the impact of the experience had left an indelible mark on both of them.